South Africa is in a very vulnerable place as a country. And for the Christians out there, we want you to pray for us. We're very vulnerable. There is no country in the world that is more prone to falling for critical theory and social justice ideology than this nation, because of our racist heritage. I mean, we actually had institutionalized racism. And so we're extremely vulnerable to the philosophy that's swept across the globe, more so than any other nation, perhaps.
Ladies and gentlemen, you may have heard that white farmers are being murdered in South Africa and their land is being taken. And in fact, President Trump recently had the president of South Africa in the Oval Office, and he showed him a video of what was going on in his own country. Now, of course, the media denies this is happening, but is it true? Well, my guest today actually lives in South Africa, and his uncle was a farmer who was murdered in 2007. So despite the media denials, this has been going on for quite a while. Can you imagine the media getting something wrong? Yeah, this is why Cal Thomas famously said, every day I read the New York Times and the Bible just to see what both sides are doing. Now, why is this happening? What's the state of the church in South Africa? What do the universities in South Africa have to do with this? Does fatherlessness have anything to do with it? And how about social justice and CRT and all that theory? Does that have anything to do with it? What about the history of apartheid and racism in South Africa? Is this all about sort of spiritual power encounters? Or is it really more about truth and lies? What is the state of apologetics in South Africa? Do students there even know logic? Do they have good thinking skills? Can they detect error? Well, my guest today is a longtime friend. He actually went to Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I went, and he's an apologist who lives in South Africa. His name is Simon Brace. He helped found Ratio Christi. What's Ratio Christi? It means reason for Christ. They have hundreds of chapters, mostly on college campuses. In fact, when I go to a college campus, quite often it's Ratio Christi inviting me. And Simon was such a leader at SES when he was here. He's now living in South Africa with his wife and 5 kids. He was such a leader in South Africa, or I should say at SES, that we actually had a saying. It went like this: Jesus loves you and Simon has a wonderful plan for your life. So here he is, ladies and gentlemen, the great Simon Brace, who's doing apologetics down in South Africa. Simon, how are you?
I'm well, thanks. It's good to see you, Frank. Good to meet you and your team.
Yeah, Simon, it's always good seeing you. Can you believe it was 10 years ago this summer that I came to South Africa, and we toured a lot of the country, spoke a lot of places. And I'll tell you, I'll never forget when we went to Tembisa. For those of you that don't know, it's a slum near Johannesburg. And we went into this slum, and you remember Pastor Vincent?
That's right.
Pastor Vincent there, who...
Yeah, Pastor Vincent Matthews. Yeah.
Yes. We go into this slum, ladies and gentlemen, and literally people are, they're living in cardboard boxes, literally. And we go into this cement cinder block church, and Vincent Matthews is there. He had moved, get this, friends, he had moved his entire family, his wife and 10 kids, from America to South Africa to minister in the slum known as Tembisa. And I spoke there. Simon, you were there. You spoke there. And they tried to give us an offering at the end of this?
Yes.
These are people that have nothing. And they put all these little coins in this envelope, and they put it at my feet when I was done speaking. I went to Bishop Matthews. I said, Pastor, can we give this to a needy family, or can we give it to the church or something? These people were sold out for Jesus, and they had absolutely nothing, Simon.
Yeah.
It was an amazing experience to go there. And you're ministering there now. Tell our listeners what you do there, our listeners and viewers. What do you do in South Africa now?
Well, I'm heading up Ratio Christi here in South Africa. So our work is focused predominantly on our campuses. Being involved with Ratio Christi in the US, we kind of have seen RC International growing. And so we're planting chapters here and ministering in the local churches. And so, yeah, we're building the kingdom of Jesus down here in South Africa and preaching the gospel, defending the faith, discipling young people, and trying to encourage the church to stand in these mad days. And so that's what we're up to.
Well, let's start with what's in the news, and then we can talk about other issues. But there is a kill the boar movement, and I guess a boar is a farmer that has been going on in South Africa for many years now. President Trump actually showed the video to the president of South Africa, and many farmers have been killed and their land has been taken. Your uncle was one of them. Tell us what happened there.
So my uncle, ironically, moved down from a farm in Zimbabwe. And we're going to talk a bit about Zimbabwe because, of course, the fear of most South Africans is that we end up becoming like Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe also had a small group of commercial farmers who basically fed that country and gave it food security. And they lost all their farms and some of them lost their lives. And so ironically, he moved from a farm down there but was killed on a farm on the East Coast in 2007. I was actually studying at SES when that happened. And so, unfortunately, he's one of the sad statistics that's tied in now to the number of farmers who've been murdered since 1994. And the difficulty with a lot of what's going on now is there's a lot of facts and statistics that are being thrown around. And, of course, when Trump put this in front of Cyril Ramaphosa, the media went crazy and all the fact-checking folks went out there and put out a few stats there. So it's important for our hearers to understand something of the truth of what's going on here. You know, there's between 30 to 40,000 commercial farmers in South Africa, and since 1994, about 2,300 of them have been murdered. So that's not a good statistic, percentage-wise. So it's a very hazardous occupation here. Now, it's not only white farmers who are murdered; there are black farmers who are murdered as well. And in part, it's also they're very vulnerable, obviously being isolated on a farm, so you're an easy target for these criminals. But South Africa as a nation has got massive problems. That's one of our big problems. It's what's happening on our farms. But our murder rate is one of the highest in the world. I think 27,000 murders a year. We have about 75 murders a day in South Africa. So it's a violent country. There's real challenges and problems here in our nation, and so and it's tied into our long, painful history. We've got a very troubled history, not just between European people and black people, but even amongst the many different tribal groups here in South Africa. Lots of conflicts, and so there's a lot. South Africa's in the new international newspapers a lot now. It seems like we're on every news show. We're kind of caught in a lot of the media all over the world now for all kinds of reasons. I think that in some sense we're a country who's suffering from an identity crisis. We don't know really what we want in terms of a philosophy through which to govern ourselves. We've got the tremendous influence of socialism and Marxist ideology, which continues to dominate the South African political landscape. We've got rampant buying into social justice and critical theory here. We can talk a bit about that. But it's also tied to the history and legacy of apartheid. And so in some sense, South Africa is in a very vulnerable place as a country. And for the Christians out there, we want you to pray for us. We're very vulnerable. There is no country in the world that is more prone to falling for critical theory and social justice ideology than this nation because of our racist heritage. I mean, we actually had institutionalized racism. And so we're extremely vulnerable to the philosophy that's swept across the globe, more so than any other nation, perhaps. And so we're now in the papers all over the place. If it's not US aid being cancelled, it's also, I think, our famous South African Elon Musk is also obviously in America. He's obviously, no doubt, had something to say there as well. We're part of BRICS as well. And so we're torn in some sense between Russia and our alliances there with China, who supported the ANC during the apartheid wars and battles then. And
what's the ANC? What's the ANC?
The ANC is the leading political party who have been basically in charge of South Africa since the 1994 elections, since Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And they've, to begin with, had a huge majority, 66% of the vote. But they've slowly over the years lost that, in part because I think that their leadership has been poor, particularly since 2008. And the country has really begun to fall apart at many levels, in terms of infrastructure and governance and corruption and crime and lots of social problems. And so there's a lot of people commenting on us as a nation. At the same time, we're filing a lawsuit against Israel. You probably heard about that as well, you know?
No, I haven't. What's the lawsuit against Israel?
Well, of course, with the battle in between Hamas and Israel now, South Africa filed a lawsuit at the International Court of Justice against Israel for charging them with genocide. And so we've been in the international papers on that front, you see. So we are, and here's the irony. The irony is that the South African Defense Forces has been fighting ISIS in Mozambique. And so there's a level of hypocrisy. Going on here. Our own defense force fighting them. Whatever you make of the battle in Israel, and that's a separate thing. But we seem to be in the forefront of a lot of things. Of the big five nations in BRICS, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. We're really the small fish there economically. I mean, compared to those four nations, we're tiny. Nevertheless, we're part of that now, and we're caught in that tension between America and the European countries and the powerful nations, and you know we're a kind of caught between that. So that's where we are as a nation, and so we find ourselves in the news a lot.
Well, you've got 65 million people in South Africa. It was an apartheid country until about 1994.
Yes.
And I can almost hear people saying, well, these whites now are getting what they deserved, right? You hear people saying that as if new racism is the best way to fight old racism. That doesn't make any sense.
Yes.
As if someone's grandchild ought to be punished for what the grandfather did. But let me ask you this. I know the ANC is in power now. There's another group, Simon, known as the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. And that is they were in a video that Trump showed to your president in this big stadium chanting, kill the boer, kill the farmer. Are these EFF people, are they supported by your government, or are they held at arm's length by your government? Are they condemned by your government? What's the situation there?
Well, interestingly, the EFF, if you actually go back historically, is evidence of the splintering and the fracturing of the ANC. Julius Malema, the head of the EFF, used to be part of the ANC Youth League. And then he had altercations with him and formed his own political party. And so it was in some sense born out of that as well. And there's a new one that formed in the most recent election called Umkhonto weSizwe, formed by Jacob Zuma, the former president. So it's just these political parties of evidence of the fracturing of the ANC party. And so he leads that group now. But in some sense, he's an old school Marxist, Bolshevik tendencies. He's not like your more polished Western European or American, university Marxists who want to, put a nice cover over this thing. He kind of tells it like it is, Bolshevik style, and you can hear that in his rhetoric. And so he's very happy to talk about violence and the necessity of violence. I mean, they draw heavily upon here in South Africa. If you speak to a lot of students, this is their Bible. Frantz Fanon's work, The Wretched of the Earth, is a text that they read a lot, and inspired by the work of Frantz Fanon. And if you get into critical theory and decolonial theory, then Frantz Fanon is a leading thinker, and they drink deeply from Frantz Fanon. And he's an old school Marxist for sure, with a dose of French existential philosophy. And so they drink deeply from that well, and they tell it like it is. I mean, they're revolutionaries, and they use that language.
So will your president condemn such violent talk or not?
Our president is a brilliant politician. He never really commits himself to saying anything. because he's trying to appease everybody, in my estimation. And so when he came into power, there's a lot of expectation, but he refuses to take a position on anything ultimately and being in principle. And so he won't say that outright. And furthermore, they won't confront the obvious racism that's driving and lying behind much of the EFF's language and statements. And so this is unfortunate. There's a lot of cowardice, unfortunately, in lack of principle, in my estimation.
Isn't it interesting, ladies and gentlemen, in our country, when people in South Africa sought political refuge because their lives were in danger, the media and many on the left said, oh, these people can't come here because they're white, essentially, which just blows my mind that people would literally say this. And they've said this on places like MSNBC and CNN, that these white people can't come here to America. The racism is overt here, even in America. And it saddens. It should sadden every Christian to see this. People are made in the image of God, regardless of their color, and they all ought to be treated with respect. But this idea that because you're white, you're not a true refugee, your life isn't in danger because you come from South Africa, because you don't look like what we expect a refugee would look like, you can't come here. I mean, it's amazing that this Marxism has seeped in everywhere, Simon. And I know that you are a student of this and you expose it. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the universities in South Africa that's driving this kind of racism.
Okay, so one thing I'm going to say here to everybody is, don't think for a moment that when you leave your foreign country and you come to South Africa that things are any different from how they are in the US. We are fighting, for the most part, on just about every issue, exactly the same things you're fighting on US campuses. There is nothing new here on South African campuses. All our universities have swallowed the whole social justice narrative. We use the same arguments. We appeal to the same scholars. We too read Judith Butler's works, Ibram X. Kendi. We quote the same people. Our curriculum is full of the same stuff. So our universities have been completely and totally co-opted by the social justice movement here. And this is the main battle in our country, because all conversations about any specific issue is colored and tainted now with this cultural Marxism or the social justice movement. And there's not a single issue that you can bring up in the country that isn't affected by this. And so in the last few years, we have been doing a lot of work on our campuses pushing back against these issues. In some sense, I would agree with J.D. Vance before I think Trump hired him. He gave a great lecture on the universities and said, look here, an election only lasts 4 years. I mean, a lot of people are putting a hope in Trump, but when Trump has finished his 4-year term and the Democrats get back into America, the pen can unravel a lot of the gains that might well have been made. But the issue is really the universities, because the professors get to stay in. They don't get reelected. And we have the same problem here. These ideas, these concepts on gender and sexuality, it didn't come from the brain of a politician. They've come from intellectuals like Judith Butler or Gail Rubin in the area of feminism. When it comes to political theory, we're looking at people like in law, Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins. These are the same scholars that you are Americans, and we're using them here. They are shaping our jurisprudence classes in our law schools. We're teaching critical race theory here. And in every discipline it's been used. We're also doing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the corporate world here. And we are also doing, critical pedagogy. The Brazilian Marxist, Paulo Freire. This is the main textbook in terms of driving the philosophy behind our education. This is the same guy in terms of who laid the foundation that Henry Giroux took that into American schools. We're drinking the same stuff and we're fighting much of the same battles here on our campuses that you are in the US.
It's exported from here to there. It's the same kind of thing going on. And it's partly the same solution too, and that is good reasoning, good evidence, which you're committed to, as I try and be as well. You went to SES to get an education, came all the way from South Africa to do so. By the way, friends, still a great place to get an education, Southern Evangelical Seminary, ses.edu. It's all online now. You don't even have to move anymore. But Simon, you're doing such great work down there. And there's another element that I want to unpack with you that is important. In addition to the universities, I've heard you talk about fatherlessness in South Africa. We have an issue with it here. About 40% of every child born in America is born into a fatherless home, but it's actually even more pronounced in South Africa. What is it, and what kind of effects does it have on the community, on the nation?
Well, Frank, a lot of people, when they're looking at countries and they're doing a critique and analysis, they will look at things like freedom indexes, or how well they tie into free market economics. And all of those things are very important. But as Christians, I think we want to look at a much more fundamental analysis of where a nation is. And then I think it ultimately has to do with righteousness, and ultimately the condition at some level of the family, the first institution that God created. South Africa is officially the most fatherless nation in the world. 7 out of every 10 children in South Africa are born into a fatherless home.
70%.
We have 70%, nearly 70%,
Wow.
particularly amongst black South Africans. That is a terrifying statistic. So I would argue that the vast majority of our problems in South Africa begin there. They begin because we have a generation of people with no ethic. And out of that, we get all of our problems. It affects everything in society. And so what is worse is with that reprehensible statistic. And it's important that historically there were issues there that led to the breakdown in the family as a result of apartheid policies. But the social justice movement picked up beautifully on that with its Marxism. Of course, Marx calls for the abolition of family in the Communist Manifesto. I mean, he doesn't mince his words. He calls out for the abolition of family. And the feminists continue with that. And now you've got the universities who are championing more of that. They want to, just like in America, they're calling for the disruption of cis heteronormativity in our schools. That's your language. That's all the new vocab that they've invented, like a cult. And we have the same stuff here. So as bad as that statistics are, we are doubling down now with institutions who are calling for more fatherlessness, for feminists who are glorying in the abolition of family. And so I think that for South Africa, our fundamental problem is fatherlessness. And this is where the church has a huge role to play, because how can we expect politicians to deal with that? They don't really have an answer to that in some sense, to the extent that the church has a role to lay out the vision of the family, to give the examples, to become a family for the people who are broken out there. And so ultimately, I think that this is where the fundamental battle is. I mean, you can listen to economists and these people give their kind of analysis and all those things. And I think those are important. You listen to Rob Hersoff, and he talks a bit about that. But if your social society is shattered at a foundational level, then it doesn't matter how good some of those policies are, it's just going to fall apart at the seam. And we're at that crisis now. It's brokenness of the family that is fundamental here.
Yeah, in fact, in our country anyway, what the government tries to do actually turns out to be counterproductive in many cases. They create this elaborate social safety net where the mother gets more money the more kids she has, as long as the father is not in the household. So if she's unmarried and continues to have kids, she gets more and more welfare, which I know it's well intended, but it has this negative unintended consequence of creating even more fatherless children. And that is a disaster. You look at every single statistic between a fatherless child and a child brought up with a father, and the fatherless child tragically has outcomes that are far, far, far less optimal than a kid who has a father in the home. It's actually a disaster, ladies and gentlemen. And so it really does start in the home. Politics is important, but there's, as Simon just said, there's nothing more important than the biological two-parent family staying together and bringing up children. That is the ultimate form of government that creates a healthy society. When that breaks down, everything else goes with it. And speaking of families and strong families, what's going to happen, as you know, our program is on the American Family Radio Network, among other nations. And AFA has been fighting for strong families for so long. I'm privileged to be on that network. And this Friday, June 13th, I'm going to be at the AFA Activate Summit. I'm speaking 3 times. We're going to talk about the existence of God, the evidence for the resurrection, and taking a lot of questions. If you go to our website, crossexamine.org, click on events, you'll see it there. It's the AFA Activate Summit. You can also go to the American Family Association website and get more information. It's in Tupelo, Mississippi, June 13th. So check it out there. I'll later be I'll be at the Faith Assembly in Orlando on the 29th of June. That's a Sunday. We'll do the Sunday morning services and Sunday evening event. So a lot coming up there. Also want to mention that the Cross-Examine Instructor Academy, CIA, the 18th meeting of it will happen in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's going to be July 31st through August 2nd. I'll be there along with Greg Kokel, Natasha Crane, Elisa Childers, Alan Parr, Jorge Gill, Brett Kunkel, Bobby Conway, several others will be your instructors, so you can learn how to better do apologetics and answer questions. You'll not only be presented to by us, you'll present to us. It's going to help you improve your presentation skills. And by the way, if you don't want to present, that's fine, because we have a non-presenter track as well, but you need to actually apply soon, because we're running out of time and running out of room. So go to crossexamine.org, click on events. You'll see what is CIA, Cross-Examine Instructor Academy. By the way, the best thing about CIA that people keep coming back for is it's not just lectures and Q&A and how to do your presentations better, but you'll also interact with us during breaks. We eat lunch together, we go to dinner, we hang out, so it's a lot of fun. You get to meet the people you've been listening to if you're into apologetics. So come to the Cross-Examine Instructor Academy this summer. All right, let me go back to my guest, Simon Brace, all the way from South Africa. Simon, let's talk a little bit about some solutions to this. And you're devoted to solutions because you've been working with students for so long down there. First of all, give us a taste of whether or not students, when they go to college, know anything about logic and fallacies. Have they been taught logic? Do they know how to detect the illogic of the postmodern critical theory movement?
No, unfortunately not, Frank. And so I actually do a lecture down here on, I call it the journey of a high schooler. And I basically show them that they go through school, they get a great education, and then as they leave school and they get into university, the first thing that happens to them is they get plowed with philosophical skepticism. And it takes a university to disabuse you of your common sense and good reason, or any reason you have. And so we at Christi, we actually teach logic. It doesn't sound very spiritual, but one of the things that impacted me the most at SCS was taking a class in logic, because we're living in an age where people are talking about lived experience as primary and feelings as the most important thing. And truth has been thrown out to the window. And we can thank the French existential philosophers for throwing truth out the window. And so it's sad to see how the use of postmodern philosophy is sold to these kids. They bomb them with Gestalt psychology and all kinds of skepticism. And then once the kids buy into that philosophy, and you don't believe in truth anymore, well, then you can be sold anything. And let's face it, we've been sold anything. When the woman of the year is a bloke, then you know you've been sold the bill of goods. And this is what we've got down here. We're now here in South Africa fighting in our schools now. Our first legal battles are fighting over here. Medical friends of mine have been reported to the authorities because they've taken a stand against transgender medicine in South Africa. Because remember, South Africa we are the Canada of Africa. We're the most liberal country in Africa. And we are a beachhead to get a lot of the progressive ideas into the rest of the continent, because we also have the most number of highest ranked universities. So a lot of African leadership is on our campuses, graduate level and doctoral level students. And so it's a real battleground. But coming back to the question of logic, we have to teach them logic, because the universities, by the way, this is actually a quote from one of the liberal professors from Stellenbosch University, a woman by the name of Amanda Gous. In an article she wrote, challenging a friend of mine on an article she wrote, she said that they're teaching the students critical theory so they can teach them critical thinking skills. That's right, because critical theory is critical thinking. And that's what the students are being told, is that, well, if we teach you this philosophy of critical theory and you can see through all the social constructs, we can red pill you, and then you can realize that ethics your parents taught to you was oppressive, and you really come to see your true self, and you can have a nice little French Revolution in your own heart, and join Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Wait, Simon. How do people not see that a philosophy that says there is no truth? How do people not see that when they try and provide truth to these kids, that their whole position is self-defeating? Wait, I thought you just said there isn't any truth, yet you're trying to say there is truth out there and there's oppressed and oppressors. How do they get away with this?
It's unbelievable, Frank, that this philosophy as postmodern is passed off as the intellectual high ground. I remember first when we were studying at SCS, and once the absurdity of the philosophy was pointed out, and you see how prevalent it is and how it's everywhere, you can't believe then after that this would actually be considered to be the intellectual high ground of our top institutions. And so, one of the things we try to do is, if you can teach kids how to see a self-defeating statement, man, it liberates them. And that's what we do. We teach them to ask good questions and to point out this philosophy, the contradictions which mount up. And of course, we also have to teach them on how to distinguish between arguments and people just emoting. Because a lot of the time it's just raw emotions and noise that is winning the day. I was actually recently going over some philosophy with my students, and if you go back into the history of philosophy, Plato is dealing with the sophists back in his time, and there's little to separate their philosophy from the modern day postmodernists. They were also relativists in some sense, and so he had a view of these people who were anti-reason. It was called misology, not missiology, but misology. It is people who use reason against reason. Well, that's what we've got going on in our universities today. We have academics saying that reason and logic is a white man's thing. That mathematics, this whole anti-maths and anti-science, and it's just white medicine. It's what is it? It's medico-juridical tyranny. It's a combination of white doctors with white jurists who are oppressing everybody else with their white medicine. And so this is the kind of stuff that's been fed to our students here. And unfortunately, because they can't think carefully, a lot of them are eating this up and drinking this stuff up. And we've got a battle ahead of us for sure.
So here they are saying that reason is white, and apparently they're using reason to say that, and they don't see the contradiction.
They can't see the contradiction. Yeah, you attack reason. And making sure that people still acknowledge you as being the scholar who's trying to give you an argument that by using reason that you shouldn't really use reason. When think about lived experience, that's the sine qua non. That's what everybody's affirming, is your lived experience is what is real, and anybody who challenges your lived experience is an oppressor. And this is what is the high ground now. And now, of course, you and I know that we've done some philosophy, that if you go back in the history of philosophy, you'll see that the lived experience affirmation is just tied into going back through history down to Nietzsche's idea and his whole perspectivism. And that's tied into the the skepticism which is grounded in German philosophy, idealism, namely and particularly the philosophy of Kant, where the subject is just cut off from the world, and what's true is whatever is in my own head, and the world out there doesn't. I'm not trying to conform my life to the world, but the world must conform to what's going on in my head. And so, what am I? Whatever I think I am, whatever I say I am, and you better believe it, or else. And we've arrived at this insane juncture in history, and it's not just happening in America; it's happening here in South Africa as well. We too are believing the same things.
I want you to point out, because I saw you do this on a program you did with our friend Elisa Childers. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to put that show that Elisa and Simon did from earlier this year. It had to do with spiritual warfare in South Africa. We're going to put it in the show notes. It's an hour and a half long. It's well worth watching. But a lot of people over here, Simon, think that when they think of spiritual warfare in South Africa, it's all about demonic activity and power encounters and shamans and voodoo and okay, maybe some of that's going on, but it's really more about lies and truth, isn't it? Can you unpack that for us?
No, absolutely, Frank. Of course, you can come into South Africa and we can go and look at ATR, African traditional religion, and you can find animistic practices and that kind of stuff. But the vast majority of things with which South Africans are dealing are not foreign to what the average American or European. We're dealing with moral relativism. We're dealing with views of economics and politics. We're dealing with abortion here. We're dealing with concepts of marriage and sexuality. Those are the issues that we're contending with here in South Africa. Those things are really at the...
Still racism, too, with Kill the Boer.
And racism, yeah. Of course, that's woven into this as well. Yeah. So those are the main issues. Those are the main issues that we're dealing with here in ministry on our campuses here. We're battling socialist ideas, and the biggest lie that's been sold here, Frank, on our campuses to the students is that all of this is somehow great act of decolonization, which I've actually spoken to EFF guys. They have their groups on campus.
Describe that for people so they know. EFF
so it's the political party that's got a lot of attention because of Donald Trump's videos now. They like to wear red outfits and French berets, and they're a Marxist party, and they tell it like it is. They want the revolution, and they talk about revolutions and blood and violence, and they call for it as well.
Killing the boar, killing the farmers. These are the people doing it. Okay.
Yeah. So right. This is their rhetoric that they use. Okay. So I've actually spoken with some of them, and so I once asked these guys. I said to them, tell me a bit about your party and what you believe in. And they said, no, we're all about decolonization. And I asked them, well, what do you mean by that? And they'll say, well, to decolonize means to purge South African institutions of any Eurocentric thinking. And you've got the same kind of thing going on in America. This is all decolonization movement. So we've got to get rid of Eurocentric philosophy and that. So I said, and the first thing I said to them was, well, why are you wearing a Frenchman's hat? Why are you wearing a beret? I mean, if we're gonna purge our culture of these things, why are you wearing Marxist red? Marx was a German Jew. Lenin, whom you read, was probably whiter than I am. This is just another. Marxism is just another European philosophy.
What did he say to that?
You've just been colonized version 2.0. So the biggest lie in South Africa at the moment is that our students are being told that this entire movement is about returning them back to their African heritage and African philosophy and roots. And it's the biggest lie in South Africa. The decolonization movement is fundamentally undergirded by a philosophy, which you don't need to dig too far. It's grounded on Hegel's dialectic. Marx is a young Hegelian. It is thoroughly Marxist with a nice bit of French existentialism and a bit of feminism thrown in for good measure. That's what's been sold to a lot of the black students as returning us back to the pre-colonial period. They've just been colonized again by another European philosophy, namely Marxism. There is no returning back to an African philosophy. And I said to the guys at the EFF, I said, look, If you're interested in discussing a philosophy by which South Africans can, you know, govern ourselves, and we're going to talk about that, I'm interested in that conversation. But don't for a moment try and think that you're going to try and convince me that what you're saying here is African. I mean, none of these concepts and distinctions that you're using here are from Africa. Now, maybe you're persuaded by Marxism. Well, that's one thing, but it's certainly not African. And so this is the big lie here in South Africa at our universities. And I think it's a lie in American universities as well. The whole decolonization movement is not restoring America back to its original roots. It's about the entrenchment of just another European philosophy, namely Marxism. That's what the whole decolonization movement is all about.
And what they seem not to understand is that to say that we ought to decolonize, they're putting that forth as some sort of moral judgment that needs to happen, some sort of moral cause that needs to come to fruition. By what standard are they claiming that's right? Because why is decolonization right and colonization wrong? Unless there's a standard beyond us that we all ought to obey. So they're implying a standard like God is out there, even while they deny there is no God. They have all these moral causes without a moral standard, an objective moral standard. It's just their own, ladies and gentlemen. And I would ask, why are we worried about colonies rather than truth? I mean, why? Yep. What's the point of saying, well, my tribe is better than your tribe? If you're going to say my tribe is better than your tribe, you're actually comparing these tribes to a standard beyond both of them, as C.S. Lewis famously said in, Mere Christianity, when he said, as soon as you say the Allies are better than the Nazis, you're implying there is a standard beyond the Allies and the Nazis, and you're saying the Allies are closer to the standard than are the Nazis. So why even talking about colonization at all? That's not the issue. The issue is truth. People don't understand logic anymore, Simon. They don't understand good philosophy. And the solution is what you're doing on the ground there with Ratio Christi. And by the way, friends, if you want to support Simon and what he's doing, we personally do. Where can they go to support you, Simon? If they wanted to support the work you're doing on the ground there, where do they go?
Well, we have our Ratio Christi South Africa website. So here in South Africa, it's just ratiochristi.co.za. And we've got our details there. But because I'm also involved with Ratio Christi in the US, I still sit on the board in the US, I have my information there as well. And so if you're interested in supporting us over here like Frank does, you can get our details and information there at Ratio Christi in the US as well. And so,
in fact, we'll put those. Yeah, we're going to put those links in the show notes. You can also, if you just Google Simon Brace, Ratio Christi, ratio, just like ratio, RATIO. It means reason for Christ. Christi, CHRISTI. If you just Google that, you'll find Simon. So yeah, Simon and his wife, Nell, and 5 kids, they're doing great work over there. Simon, tell us a little bit about what you discovered with regard to U.S. aid going over there. Here in the U.S., there's been a controversy when a South African, Elon Musk, came in and said, hey, we got to stop U.S. aid. And so did Secretary Rubio, said, because it's going not to what you think it's going. What was U.S. aid dollars going to support in South Africa?
Oh, gosh, I'll tell you what. So, I've got the documents. I think I sent you some links to some of the stuff now. So USAID was, of course, there was some good work that they were doing, and we want to make some distinctions. But the main problem with the work of USAID is it was a key funder behind comprehensive sexuality education in South Africa. And so they had their proxy organizations here and NGOs who basically funded the curriculum. They hired people to get this curriculum to teach progressive sexual ethics in our schools here in South Africa. And I've sent the links to you there. You can go and follow this work now. They were supported by funding from the EU as well. Of course, the EU is on board with progressivism as well. But what's really, really poor, Frank, is our universities were involved with that. So much for decolonization. Our universities want to get back to African roots, and yet we've got the American organizations and European organizations telling Africans what they should think about sex and sexuality, funded by USAID. Now, of course, of all the things that USA did the worst was they funded a lot of pro-abortion organizations here in Africa. And as bad as the education things are, that's arguably the worst thing on the planet is abortion. I think it's the greatest evil on our planet, is what we do to the unborn. And so the USAID was behind that as well. And so it was a good thing that they looked into that now and said, no, we're not supporting these things in Africa. Most black women in Africa know what an abortion is. A lot of African countries don't have those laws, and they don't want them. They're not. Black women in Africa aren't so stupid so as to think that when you go in for an abortion that it's just like having your appendix taken out. Everybody knows exactly what that procedure is all about. Everybody knows. You have to have drunk so deeply from French existential feminism to have lied to yourself in thinking that that action is somehow some great act of liberation for a woman, as if a woman butchering the child within her is somehow performing some liberatory act. I mean, it's just, and so that, I am glad that they looked into that, and I am glad that they cut off some of the funding on there. And again, as well, I mean, people must also remember USAID was part of Americans' charity to the rest of the world in terms of, it's a great thing. The Americans are a great people in terms of giving, and I think that South Africans must also be careful in being presumptuous that just because people are charitable that you should be expected to receive that. The Americans have helped us in many respects, but at the same time, we need to make some distinctions here. And definitely under the Biden and Obama administration, USAID was using US taxpayer money to drive progressive ethics, definitely here in South Africa and most certainly in other countries in Africa. And I can also give you the information there, which you want to put links up to that as well for people to go and look into, and you can see all of that there as well.
Now, why would they do that, Simon, if they were against colonialism? Why would the U.S. be sending money and ideology to try and convince the South Africans they ought to live a different way, our way, if we're supposed to be against colonialism? I mean, ladies and gentlemen, the contradictions are everywhere. Sorry, go ahead, Simon.
Yeah. No, well, I was going to say, I mean, our top academic institution in the nation is the University of Cape Town. And a few years ago, they came out with a statement. It was in some kind of article that they wrote. And this is the phrase, I think I can recall it by memory now. They said decolonization necessarily includes the degendering of Africa. Okay? So think about that for a moment. In order to decolonize Africa, okay, that is to return Africa back to its pristine utopian past, which it was never the case as well. A lot of the African people had tremendous conflicts with each other, and that. But somehow, to get people back to their original utopia, we have to degender Africa. Now, I'm not an expert on African culture, like Black culture. I'm learning, I'm reading, I'm studying. But I'm pretty convinced that most Black people in Africa do not believe that Africa prior to the white man's arrival was some kind of androgynous mass of transgendered individuals. This is absurd, Frank, and this is coming from our top academic institution in the country. That somehow, to get back to our pristine African past, we need to degender the African continent, because, you know, the binary was also a white man's concept, a construct foisted upon all of us.
Oh, biology is a white man's biology. Okay.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is insanity, and yet it's taught at the highest levels, put forth as some sort of sophisticated theory to liberate people from the oppression of reality. That's what it's really about. What book do you have there, Simon?
So I was going to show you a book because, I mean, let's face it now. This is where the fight comes down to. Our fight here in South Africa is your fight. Ultimately, the battle we have now is not with politicians. It's the battle between people like Judith Butler, who's defined for the rest of the world what sexes are. And she said sex is a social construct. Of course, she builds her work upon the shoulders of Michel Foucault, and she doesn't bring anything new to the table, and she's working on that. But we are fighting ultimately this stuff here in South Africa. In fact, right now, we've got a lawsuit going on in the Western Cape with friends of mine, or in our first lawsuit now at a primary school, battling over this issue now. And what we're fighting against is not the politicians. It's these ideas that have come through the university from intellectuals like Judith Butler and Gail Rubin and others like her, who've decided for the rest of the world that they understand sex and sexuality than the rest of us. And so they're going to give the new understanding to us all. And if we don't bend the knee to what they're saying, okay, then we need to be dealt with. And this is the battle. This is why I think J.D. Vance's lecture he gave a year before I think Donald Trump picked him on the universities is the key battle, not just for us here in South Africa, but for many nations. These institutions now don't get to have to run for election, and they're getting away with teaching this philosophy, much of which is at odds with the very citizens of those nations. We don't believe the stuff. We don't want the stuff. We don't want you to come in here and smash our families up with your bankrupt, godless philosophy. Thank you very much. And so we're in the same fight as you guys are, Frank. And that's why it's very important. And I say this to my American friends. The fight in America is bigger in some sense than our fight because of the influence and scale of America in terms of its institutions and just the size of a nation. If the fight goes a particular direction, it affects smaller nations like ourselves. So for Christians to fight in America against these things and to win results, it impacts us here in these smaller countries. If things happen in a small country like Zimbabwe, it doesn't affect these major nations. It's of no consequence. But what happens in America and Europe and these major powerhouse countries matters to us smaller countries. It affects us in many, many ways. And so it's very important for Christians to understand that when you're fighting there, you're not just fighting for your own country. You're actually doing battle for us brothers and sisters in other countries, because we are in a position where we're so vulnerable to the power of these countries to come and be manipulated and coerced into things like running out new educational philosophies, which are at odds with I would argue, a biblical view or a common sense view of the world. And that's why it's important for American Christians to stand up and fight, not just for their own country, but for other nations like us down here.
Well said, Simon. In fact, we're going to put a whole number of links in the show notes. And for those of you listening on radio, you're going, where are these show notes? Look for the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast, or go to the Cross-Examined YouTube channel. 2 words, Cross-Examined. You will find it. And in the show notes, we will have it. By the way, that speech that J.D. Vance gave, he gave before he was even a politician. This is in November of 2021. He wasn't even in the U.S. Senate then, much less the vice presidency. And it's a very good speech on what's going on university campuses. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Simon Brace, it's been a joy having you on. It's great seeing you again. Thanks for the work you're doing. Again, we'll put a link to where Simon is in the show notes. And if you want to support the work he and Nell are doing down there, that'd be great as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a...
Frank, one second before you go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Come, guys. Come, all of you. Come on, students. Come.
Oh, you got all the students here.
Yeah, Frank,
check this out. All right.
Come, here we go. Pull the screen up. There's all the students. Frank, thanks so much for what you do, man.
Excellent. Good to see you guys.
Keep up the good work.
All right. God bless you guys.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Yes,
thanks, Simon.
Frank.
See you. Say goodbye to Nell. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, folks. See you.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.